My name is Michael. I'm 37 years old, and I live in a quiet suburb in Virginia. I'm going to tell a story that happened to me and my wife Emily about 5 years ago, but it still gives me that strange chill down my spine every time I think about it. It's not one of those horror movie stories with monsters or clear ghosts. It was something simple but too real, and I still can't explain it. It was an autumn Saturday, the kind of day that feels perfect for a walk. The leaves were already falling, and the air had that smell of cold approaching, you know? Emily and I like to explore trails around the area, nothing too fancy, just to enjoy the silence and break the routine. That day, we chose a new trail that a friend had recommended. It was near a small forest reserve, about a 40-minute drive from our house. We got there around 4 p.m. The place was deserted, the parking lot empty. The main trail was wide, with tall trees on both sides. I don't know why, but as soon as we entered, the silence bothered me. There were no birds singing, no wind rustling the leaves, just the sound of our footsteps on the ground covered with dry leaves. Emily even mentioned that the place seemed stagnant. I laughed and moved on, pretending I hadn't felt the same thing. The trail was pretty easy at first, not much of a challenge. What caught my attention was how the environment seemed so isolated. The air was cold, but there was no wind, and the sun was already starting to set, creating long shadows between the trees. It was as if time was somehow slower there. Emily commented that it was strange that there was no one else around. That made me feel a bit uncomfortable, but I tried not to think about it. After about 20 minutes of walking, we came to a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight, but to the right there was a much narrower path, almost hidden, with twisted trees and brown leaves covering everything. It was the kind of place that looked like no one had ever stepped foot there. And that's when we saw the child. She was standing at the very start of the narrow path. She looked about 7 or 8 years old, with straight blonde hair falling over her shoulders. She wore a white dress, completely clean, which seemed strange considering the damp ground and mud. She didn't say anything, just stood there, staring in our direction, and then, this was the worst part, slowly raised her arm and pointed to the path. I froze for a second. I can't explain it, but it felt wrong. Kids don't just appear alone in the middle of a forest like that, without a backpack, without any adults around. Emily nudged me, nervous, and asked quietly if I was seeing that. Of course, I was. My mouth went dry as I looked at the child, who didn't move. She just pointed. "There's something wrong here. Let's turn back," I murmured to Emily. She agreed too quickly, as if she had been waiting for me to say that. We turned around and started walking back toward the main trail, trying to ignore the heavy feeling that seemed to follow us. I glanced back one last time before leaving the fork, and the child was still there, standing and pointing, but now she was looking directly at me. I can't explain it, but it felt like she knew we were scared. We kept walking faster, wanting to get out of there as soon as possible. I tried to make conversation to cover up the nervousness, but Emily stayed silent. After about 5 minutes, I felt that strange chill again, like someone was watching me. I turned my face slightly and, I swear to you, the child was there. She was closer this time, standing in the middle of the main trail, as if she had followed us. I didn't hear footsteps, I didn't hear anything. She just appeared. Again, she pointed back, as if she wanted us to go back to that narrow path. "How did she get here so fast?" Emily whispered, gripping my arm tightly. I didn't know how to answer. I was trying to act rationally, telling myself it was just a lost child. Maybe the parents were nearby, but my brain was screaming something else. It didn't make sense. Even if she had run, how did we not hear any sound? Why wasn't she saying anything? Why wasn't she moving? We kept walking, this time faster. I didn't want to look back, but it was as if something was forcing me. After a few meters, I gave in and glanced over my shoulder. She was even closer. I could almost make out her face, but the fading sunlight blurred her features. I don't know if it was just my mind playing tricks, but the way she stood, her arms still outstretched, seemed wrong. Like it was something imitating a child, not a real one. I told Emily we should start running. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was instinct. I just grabbed her hand and we started running faster, our hearts pounding. I could hear her footsteps hitting the ground, dry and fast. Emily looked back in the middle of the run and whispered an almost inaudible, "My God." I didn't have the courage to look again. I knew she was there. We ran all the way to the parking lot, and when we got close to the car, I finally stopped to look. The trail was empty. No child, no sound. Just the still forest, exactly as it had been when we arrived. We jumped into the car as quickly as possible, and I started the engine without even putting my seatbelt on. Emily kept staring out the rearview window as we left, but she didn't say anything. On the way back, neither of us spoke for a long time. The silence was heavy, as if what had happened had left a mark there. Finally, Emily broke the silence and asked what I thought that had been. "I don't know," I replied, and it was the truth. There was no explanation. A child doesn't move like that. A child doesn't appear and disappear without making any sound. When we got home, I tried to find something on the internet about that trail, but I didn't find anything other than common hiking reports. No legends, no disappearances. I stared at the computer screen for a while, with the image of the child in my head. The too clean white dress, the rigid arm pointing, the vacant look that seemed to really see us. In the following days, I tried to forget. We never went back to that trail, nor to any other for a long time. But there's one thing that still bothers me. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept thinking, what if we had followed what the child was pointing at? What would have happened? I don't want to know. What happened didn't leave my mind. Every night, I found myself wondering what that moment had been. The child standing there with that fixed look. I knew something was wrong, but the thought that it could have just been a trick of my mind made me feel a little safer. I never told anyone what happened, except Emily, of course. But the fact that she was also disturbed made me realize it wasn't just in my head. The strangest thing about all this, however, was something that happened a few months later. We were doing some cleaning around the house, organizing old things, and I found a photo of us in an album that was a few years old. It was a photo from a trip we took where we were in the forest reserve. It was from another hike long before that day. But the photo, something was wrong. That trail was there, in the background, and at the end of the trail, the child. She was in the photo. But there was no way it could be the same one. It was the same clothes, the same hair, and that pointing gesture. But I swear to you, we didn't see her there that day. I looked at Emily and she looked at me. We stood in silence because we knew something was very, very wrong. We never went back to that place. I try to forget what happened, but as time passes, the feeling that it wasn't just a perception mistake grows stronger. I don't know what that child was, but one thing is certain. She was trying to show us something. And maybe it's better not to know what that would have been. My name is Derek, I'm 32 years old and I live in Austin, Texas. This happened about 6 years ago, but to this day I can't understand what happened. I'm sharing this here because, even after all this time, fear still haunts me. I know it might sound strange, but what my friend and I went through on that trail is something that logic cannot even begin to explain. It was a typical Saturday morning when Ryan and I decided to take a hike on a trail that we were told was easy. It wasn't too far from Austin, one of those well-known trails, with signs and everything to guide you along the way. We were both fans of hiking, so we were looking forward to enjoying the day. The weather forecast was perfect, clear skies, a perfect day for exploring. At first, everything was normal, and the trail even seemed a bit familiar. The signs were there, pointing to the paths and distances to the next stops. The kind of signage you expect to see on any well-marked trail. We were talking about silly things as we walked, enjoying the sounds of nature around us. But then, something started to bother me. Something small, almost imperceptible. The signs began pointing backwards toward the entrance. This didn't make sense. At first, I thought it might be some sort of mistake, maybe a sign placed incorrectly. But when we looked at the next one, and then the next, they were all facing backward. I looked at Ryan, who seemed just as confused as I was. He shrugged, laughing a little, saying maybe someone had messed with the signs. The idea that something was wrong quickly crossed my mind, but I convinced myself I was just being paranoid. We decided to keep going. Maybe the trail really did take a curve or something, but as we walked more, the feeling of going in the wrong direction only grew. I was starting to realize that the signs weren't like they used to be. They had a strange feeling to them, as if they were trying to tell us something, but in a way we couldn't understand. Like the symbols on the signs were reversed. I looked at Ryan, and he was already starting to get nervous. He suggested we turn back, but when we tried to retrace our steps, everything began to feel like a nightmare. The path we had followed seemed endless, as if there was no clear exit anymore. And the signs, they kept pointing back more and more insistently. The worst part was that, when I looked closer, messages began to appear. "Don't look back" was written on one of them, in large, clear letters. I felt a chill for a moment, but I still tried to ignore it. That's when Ryan asked me to stop. He was pale, with an expression I'd never seen before. He told me he had heard something he couldn't identify. A distant sound, but very clear, like someone was walking behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing. He started looking behind us, and I begged him not to, but he was determined. And that's when everything changed. When Ryan looked back, I felt something strange. It was like the atmosphere around us had suddenly shifted, a heaviness in the air, something stifling. I yelled at him, but it was too late. He was looking at something, but it wasn't anything I could see. I tried to run toward him, but he just disappeared. It wasn't a quick movement, nor a sound. He simply wasn't there anymore. It was as if he had been erased, swallowed by the trail itself. I searched for him frantically, but nothing, no trace. I tried shouting his name, my voice echoing through the empty trail, but the silence that followed was overwhelming. The air was thick and heavy, and fear took over me in a way I'd never experienced before. I no longer knew where I was or where I was going, but every step seemed to take me further away. The signs now were all covered with messages, one after another, as if they were closing in on me. "Don't look back. It's all wrong. You don't belong here." I was losing my sanity. I tried to run, but the trail seemed to shift, as if it had a life of its own, as if it was pushing me toward a place I shouldn't be. Fear turned into panic, and I started feeling a deep cold, like someone was watching me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know where to run, but as I looked ahead, I realized the entrance to the trail was right there, just ahead. I ran, without thinking, and when I passed the last sign, I saw the daylight intensifying. The sound of nature seemed to have returned, and the sense of despair was replaced by an unsettling peace. I couldn't understand what had happened, but I knew something was wrong. When I looked back, everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. That place wasn't the same, and I knew it. I knew that Ryan, whatever had happened to him, wasn't an accident. I didn't have the courage to go back there, and I never will. I never found Ryan again. I went back to the city, tried to look for him, but the reports from those who were around didn't help. There was no sign of him leaving the trail or taking any other path. After that day, the feeling that what happened was somehow beyond my understanding still haunts me to this day. I never managed to understand what happened on that trail. And I still have nightmares sometimes with the signs, with the message, with Ryan's gaze, now empty, staring at something I never saw. My name is Daniel. I'm 45 years old, and I live in a small town called Maplewood in the state of Ohio. I've always been the type of guy who liked to walk at dawn. I can't really explain why, but there was something comforting about seeing the sun rise while walking through the fields, only hearing the sound of the wind and the birds singing. Those moments gave me a peace that I couldn't find anywhere else. This happened 10 years ago, and since then, every time I think back to that day, a feeling of dread overcomes me. I'm going to tell you what happened, but please don't judge me for it. What I experienced that morning still doesn't make sense to me. It was a typical autumn day. The temperature was mild, the perfect kind of weather for a walk. I left home very early before the sun started to show itself. Maplewood is a small town, so the streets were empty. The only sounds I could hear were the dry leaves on the ground and the rustling of the breeze. I was heading toward the wheat field, a peaceful place where I like to walk alone. The fog was thicker than usual, but nothing that made me think something was wrong. Fog in Maplewood is common in the mornings, especially this time of year, so it didn't surprise me. As I walked, I began to hear a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing with the branches of the trees, But soon I realized the sound was different. It was a voice, a child's voice. It was low, almost whispered, but so clear that I could swear it was coming from somewhere nearby. It seemed to be asking for help. At first, I wasn't sure if I was hearing something real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the sound became clearer, I realized it wasn't my imagination. It was a child's voice, asking for help, and it seemed to be only a few meters away. I stopped walking and listened. The fog was so thick around me that I could barely see more than a few meters ahead. I looked around, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. But all I could see was the thick white fog, covering the field and the trees around me. I decided to follow the sound, hoping to find someone in danger, a lost child or something like that. Maybe it's just a prank, I thought, trying to push away the discomfort that was starting to take hold of me. I took a few more steps and heard it again. "Help me, please," the voice whispered. I could hear the fear in it. My instinct was to run toward the sound, but an odd sensation, as if something was wrong, made me hesitate. Even so, I continued. With every step, the fog seemed to close in around me. I was so focused on following that sound that I didn't realize how much the landscape was starting to distort. The wheat fields that I knew so well now looked like a maze, with the plants twisted by the thickness of the fog. After some time walking, the voice seemed to be even closer. "Please, help me," it repeated with a haunting lightness. I was starting to get nervous, but I didn't want to believe what was happening. The fog was so dense that I could hardly see anything but a white, cold mist. Then I saw something. A figure, a silhouette, still motionless in the middle of the fog. My heart raced. The figure was small, too small to be an adult, and was facing away from me, looking toward the horizon. I called out, but the figure didn't move. I slowly approached, each step more hesitant than the last. The voice, now inaudible, had stopped speaking, but I still felt something. A presence. It felt as if the fog had swallowed all the sound around me. I reached the figure, and when I was finally a few meters away from it, I realized it wasn't a child, but some sort of statue, a still and silent figure. It was facing away from me, wearing a dark cloak, and its appearance was indistinct, as if the details of the figure were blurred by the fog. Almost as if the figure was made of the fog itself. Fear took over me. I felt something strange, something I couldn't explain. It was like an invisible pressure was pulling me closer, as if that figure was a magnet and I was the scrap metal. But at the same time, something told me to leave as quickly as possible. I decided to turn around and start walking back. But the instant I did, the fog seemed to get even thicker. I could no longer see the path I had come from, and the field around me was lost in an endless thick mist. My heart was pounding, and I tried not to panic, but a feeling of claustrophobia started to overwhelm me. It was as if the fog was trapping me. Fear completely overtook me. I walked slowly, searching for any sign of an exit. But the fog only grew thicker. I looked back and saw the figure following me, silent and constant. It didn't move fluidly but seemed to float, as if it were a projection of the mist itself. I could no longer hear the child's voice, but the terror of being followed didn't let me think of anything else. The pressure was building, and a chilling cold seemed to emanate from the fog, enveloping my whole body. I didn't know what to do. I tried to run, but with every step, the fog seemed to envelop me more, suffocating me. The sound of my panting breath seemed muffled, as if it were being swallowed by the mist around me. The figure continued to follow me, closer now, but always silent. I didn't know where to go anymore. The fog was closed around me, and the way back no longer existed. And then suddenly, as if everything had happened at once, the fog began to dissipate. It wasn't a slow or gradual dissipation. The fog simply vanished, and I found myself back in the field I knew. The sky was clear, and the sun was beginning to rise. The figure, the voice, everything had disappeared, as if it had never been there. I stood still, looking at the fields around me, feeling my whole body tremble. There was nothing else. No child asking for help, no strange figure following me, just silence. I went back home in shock, trying to understand what had happened, but to this day I have no answers. When I researched more about it on the internet, I couldn't find anything that made sense. No explanations, no similar stories, just a feeling of emptiness, as if what I had experienced was some kind of distortion of reality. I never returned to that field. I never walked alone in the foggy mornings again. Something tells me that if I did, the fog would come back, and so would the figure. I really don't know what happened that day, but one thing I know. I'm not alone when the fog appears. My name is Brian. I'm 36 years old, and I live in Boulder, Colorado. I'm going to tell you something that happened to me and 3 friends almost 10 years ago, but it still makes me freeze just thinking about it. We were passionate about trails and adventure, always looking for new and challenging places. That's how we ended up in a valley in the northern part of the state, near a little explored area. I swear, I've never been so scared in my life as I was that day. And the worst part? I have no idea what happened. I remember that morning clearly. It was late October. The weather was cool, with a light mist covering the mountains. I was with Jake, Matt, and Sam. We had planned to explore a trail Sam found on a trekking forum. It wasn't official, which made it even more interesting. We took Jake's car and set off early, carrying our backpacks with food, water, and flashlights. The trail seemed easy at first, just a path full of rocks and dense trees. But after an hour, when we started descending into the valley, the atmosphere changed completely. We even commented on the strange silence, but we kept going. It was when Matt, who was walking in front, decided to joke around. He stopped, turned to face us, and yelled, "Hey!" His voice echoed through the valley, but there was a weird delay, like a fraction of a second slower than normal. We laughed and started playing too. I clapped, and when the echo came back, it was delayed again. We didn't think much about it at the time. We thought it was just something with the rock formation or the weather. Sam even said, "This rock must be higher than the others. That's why the delay." But no one was really paying attention. But things started to get strange a little further ahead. The valley got narrower, and the trees became denser. The sound of water from a small stream that passed beside us added a slightly eerie touch to the atmosphere. It was as if the silence was just waiting to seep in. Jake, who was further behind, shouted something, but the echo took about 3 seconds to return, and when it came back, his voice sounded distorted, like it had been recorded and played back on an old device. At that moment, no one commented, but the expressions on our faces started to change. Something was wrong. With every shout or word spoken, the echo dragged on more. It became stronger, stranger. At one point, Sam said something like, "This is getting weird," and the echo came back with a deeper tone, as if it was imitating us, but distorted, with a voice that wasn't ours. The sound wasn't just a simple echo, it felt like a response, but it came from somewhere deeper, like it was forming from a different throat. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't understand what it was exactly. When Matt yelled, "Who's there?" everything took a completely different turn. It wasn't just the echo. The sound came back altered, but more clearly. Or rather, it wasn't an echo. It was words. "Who is there?" The sound was whispery, hoarse, and as clear as our voice, but it didn't come from any of us. It was at that moment that the air became heavy. I looked at Matt's face, which was as pale as a sheet. He never showed fear, but this time his eyes were wide. Sam tried to laugh, but the laugh was forced, and Jake looked around as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. That's when we started to hear something we couldn't identify. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't our voice. It was something different, a whisper coming from deep in the valley, and the words that reached us were fragmented, as if being dragged by a wind we couldn't see. I remember hearing my name among those words. "Brian." "You lied." I froze. My body went cold. What did that mean? I knew there was something I had never told anyone, something about my personal life, but I didn't know how it could be known by a thing in that place. I looked at the others, trying to find an answer in their faces, but they were all silent, as if they too had heard it. And I knew this wasn't normal. That valley was turning into a prison, and we didn't know what was worse. The distorted voices or the fact that it felt like we were being watched the whole time. Every step we took seemed to echo in a deeper way, filled with an incomprehensible terror. Jake, usually so composed, was starting to walk faster, looking back with wide eyes, as if expecting to see something coming from behind the trees. "Let's get out of here now," he said, his voice faltering. Sam was sweating, his face pale, and Matt, who had been the bravest until then, was clearly in panic, his breath quickening. We started climbing quickly up the trail, trying to get back to where the forest opened up. But the murmurs didn't stop. They followed us, surrounded us, and it felt like the echo was becoming faster, closer, clearer. "We're not alone," Sam whispered, but no one answered. The words continued, fragmented, echoing around us, and it felt like everything was intensifying. The sense of claustrophobia increased with every second. Finally, we reached the point where the trail widened, and when I looked back, everything went silent all of a sudden. An absolute silence. I looked at the others, and they were as stunned as I was. The echo, the whispers, everything had disappeared. It was no longer there. As if all of that had been a collective hallucination. We reached the car, got in silently, and Jake started the engine without even turning on the radio. The silence in the car was palpable. No one dared to say anything until, finally, Jake broke the silence. "We never talk about this again, okay?" He looked at each of us, and no one objected. It was as if it had been something we shouldn't discuss, and that's how it was. The fear was still on our faces, but no one said a word during the entire drive back to Boulder. On the way back, a strange feeling followed me. Something wasn't right. And after a while, I started questioning everything that had happened. Was it real? Or was it that, deep down, we were all vulnerable to the same kind of fear? For weeks I avoided thinking about what had happened, but I couldn't forget. The voices were still in my mind, the murmurs, the words that knew things about me, things I had never told anyone. I never went back to that valley. I never sought to know more about it, but even so I knew. Something in that place knew about me. Knew about all of us. I don't know what that place was. I don't know what the echo was. I don't know what it wanted from us, but one thing I am sure of, that wasn't an accident. That wasn't a coincidence. And even now I still feel the presence of that feeling. Sometimes at night, when the silence is too deep, I hear the words again, echoing in my mind. I know the valley is still watching me, and maybe one day it will return, and that still scares me in a way I can't explain.